Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 11, the role of technology. The case that we'll be using in this chapter will be the Apple versus FBI case. And it's a really interesting case because we've already spoken about it briefly this semester. Let's go through the main key points. So it all started with the shooting in San Bernardino in 2015, right, where a handful of people were killed, and the iPhone was captured by the FBI of the person who did the shooting. And so the FBI then asked Apple to unlock the phone so they could find out more information about who the shooter was, who they were connected to, finding out the root of this awful incident that happened. And Apple came back, right, and said that it was against their policy to open up any of their devices. It was a privacy issue. And as you'll see in the other case from UT Austin, that Google and Amazon backed them up, saying that they stand by the Privacy Act of their devices and of their products, and they will not open it up for any organization or any company or any government. And so it went to court, and this was going back and forth. Who was right? What is the ethical decision, right? We wanted to find out the root cause of why all these people were killed in San Bernardino, but at the same time, we didn't want to open up a Pandora's box. Apple was saying that in order to get the data off that phone, they would have to create some new code, but then that code could be vulnerable to somebody getting that code and then opening up all of the Apple phones. So in the end, Apple, I guess, won because they did not open up the phone, but the FBI also got their way in that they found a way to circumvent Apple and get the information off the phone without using Apple and any additional code. So again, who was right in this situation? Let's go ahead and go through the chapter topics and talk more about the role of technology in ethical decision making. So the first thing that we just start here with is the key learning objectives. We're going to start with defining technology and its characteristics. Then we'll go through recognizing how technology has evolved through history, right? It's not just Apple phones and computers that we're talking about, right? There's harvesting and farming, which is also considered a technology. We'll talk about analyzing and assessing how technology impacts individuals and society, right? Because a lot of this course, right, because it's called Business and Society, this textbook, right? So it's all about how our actions as managers affect society in general. Then we'll be talking about understanding the potential for unwanted threats arising from individuals' use of the internet and other social media platforms. We'll be talking about the inequities in public access to technology, both in developing countries as well as in the poorer neighborhoods here in the United States. Number 6, we'll be talking about assessing the ethical challenges posed by technologies, of course. Number 7, we'll be identifying how some governments act to control or censor the use of technology by its citizens. And then number 8, evaluating the benefits and risks of recent breakthroughs in science and medicine. There'll be 2 parts to this chapter, 2 videos that I'll be talking through the topics with you. Let's hop into what is technology, right? It's a broad term referring to the practical applications of science and knowledge to commercial and organizational activities. That's a pretty fancy way of talking about what we embrace every day. There are 3 main bullet points here that I thought were super interesting. The first one being that change, right, is the dominant feature of technology, and that sometimes the pace of change is so fast and furious that it approaches the limits of human tolerance. So people lose the ability sometimes to even cope with how quickly the technology is changing. And this is the best example that we see this is with the elderly, right, that they just can't keep up with all the changes. So it can become a problem for society. The second bullet point here is that technology's effects are widespread, right? They ripple through society until every community is affected, right? That there are no borders with technology, right? It goes from the United States to Africa to Asia, any developed, less developed country, it is affecting the way that they work in business and society. And then the third bullet point here is that technology is self-reinforcing. It acts as a multiplier to encourage its own faster development. So it's exponentially getting faster. And the example that they talked about in the book, I thought was a good one, right? That we started with microprocessors and then very quickly we're onto the modern computer. And then that moves into new banking methods, right? And all this has happened within the last couple of decades, just very, very quickly. Let's move into the next slide here. Here we have those phases of development of technology that I spoke about in the objectives for this course, for this chapter. So as you see here, they consider technology this activity of harvesting in up until 1650, right? This was a nomadic agrarian phase in the development of the technology, and the primary skill was used here was manual. As you can see, we go through a handful of different phases in the development of technology, and now they're saying that we're both in the semantic, which started in 2000, and the activity is relevance and context. And the skill that we use now is intellectual and networking. And we're also very quickly moving into the biotech area, starting in 2016, where it's application of engineering and biological sciences, which again, we'll get into further detail in this chapter, where the primary skill used here is networking, but also artificial creation. Exciting things. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. So the role of technology in our daily lives is the internet. To boil it down to one major point here, the internet is that it is one of the most visible and widely used technology innovations over the past decade. And the second bullet point here is that it enables users to share information along multiple channels, linking individuals and organizations. And I think those are pretty straightforward and pretty logical bullet points. But the last two bullet points here I found super interesting. That first, in 2008, China surpassed the United States with the most internet users by country, right? And now recently in 2017, India surpassed the United States and Japan for the second largest number of internet users. So on the next slide, we have the top 10. The publisher made a mistake here. It's not the top 20, it's the top 10 internet users by country from 2017. And so you'll see here, right, that China is number 1, India is number 2. Now the United States is number 3. And then Brazil, Indonesia has really jumped. Now they're number 4, while they were much lower in previous years. There's Japan, Russia, Nigeria, Mexico, and Bangladesh. So internet usage is growing very, very quickly. And as you can see here, that in this bottom graph, Africa is just speeding up very, very quickly when it comes to internet usage, and that developing countries are catching up to developed countries amazingly fast. And what this means is that it's not only citizens that are using the internet in these underdeveloped countries, but also managers and that the way they do business. So as a manager, when you go out into the working world and you start to work with Africa or Latin America, more and more will your colleagues be using the internet, which I know sounds like a strange idea living here in the United States, but if you go to any of these countries, you'll notice that not everybody has access to the internet all the time like we do here. Great, let's hop into the next slide. So the role of technology in our daily lives. Let's talk just a little bit about this. This is all pretty common knowledge to most of you, but let's just talk through it as a base for ethical decision making. And the first thing here is that there's a behavioral addiction, which is a key role in technology, right? It's a compulsion to engage in rewarding behaviors despite negative consequences. This is the whole idea about getting on Facebook or Instagram too often and then feeling bad about your own life, right? Also that fear of missing out, FOMO, right? And so they've done a study where 4 out of the 5 major social media sites make you feel bad about yourself. That's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Snapchat. They say that only YouTube actually doesn't make you feel bad about yourself. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So if you have an itch for social media, maybe get on YouTube instead of the other ones potentially. The second bullet point here is that technology manufacturers are accused of contributing to the increasing behavioral addiction of technology. And this is where they interviewed Mark Zuckerberg about is he truly wanting to make the world addicted to his app, right? Because he makes money when people are on his app. And he came out and said that he believes that his role is to create meaningful social interactions. And I have to give him, maybe I'm naive, but I'm giving him a little bit of credit in that, right? He called it Facebook, right? Because it was based on the idea that when he was a freshman at Harvard, we actually had books where you had the person's name, what high school they came from, and maybe a little information about them. And that was called the Facebook. And then he moved that book onto a website, and now that's just exploded since then. But his primary goal at that time truly was to create meaningful social interactions, right? I don't think he really ever knew the potential and all the money that he could possibly be making at that time. So at the same time, he does make a lot of money, right? When we get addicted to those items, addicted to those sites. So let's move on to the third bullet point, because again, we could talk about that issue all day long. The third bullet point here talks about how some countries are considering what are called Cinderella laws to protect children from playing certain games after midnight. So when the clock strikes midnight, then everything shuts down. And the two main countries that are implementing this right now are South Korea and China, because there have been some studies that children in those countries are truly becoming overly addicted to online entertainment, right? There are even like camps, right, for Chinese boys to go to in the summer to get away from their addiction, because they're having withdrawal symptoms, etc. That it's a true traditional addiction. So there are two major unwanted internet threats that this chapter talks about, which I know you're all familiar with, right? Spam. We'll just differentiate the two real quick. Spam is unsolicited commercial emails or junk emails sent in bulk to valid email and mobile accounts. And I thought this was interesting, these two sub-bullet points, that it has caused extra network traffic and wasted time sorting through the irrelevant and unwanted emails to access desired messages. So on our next slide, we're going to look at the percentage of all email traffic that is spam. It's crazy. In recent years, it has been over 60% of all email sent. But before we get to that slide, let's talk just a little bit about how the UK and the US have anti-spam legislation. I was surprised that the book didn't mention other countries, but I think why they focus on the UK and the US is because they see that a good portion of the spam messages are actually coming from the US, believe it or not. So let's go into this graph here. You'll see that, as I said, this talks about the global spam volume, and that over here on the left-hand side, this is a percentage of the total email volume, and that there were some really great anti-spam tools implemented here in 2015, but since then, those spammers have found out ways to get through those software packages that stop the spam. And now we're still hovering here around, looks like 55-60% as of July 2017. The next and the second unwanted internet threat is phishing, right? This is the practice of stealing consumers' personal identity, data, and financial account credential by using fake emails. So when I think of phishing, I think of my parents or grandparents or uncles and aunts, right? They can fall vulnerable to this, right? The younger generations, we can see through those phishing emails, but people who are not as familiar with the internet, they can have an issue with that. They will believe that there's a problem and that they need to send $1,000 to help someone who is potentially in Africa, when actually that is just from someone who's malicious and trying to get money out of someone. Before I hop on to the next slide, I did want to bring up about this organization that the book mentions, the Anti-Phishing Working Group, because this course we talk a lot about multiple stakeholders and industry associations. And so this APWG, Anti-Phishing Working Group, they create reports regularly about the current phishing trends. And so if you ever were to work in technology or for an organization, that is involved in phishing, which lots of banks have issues with emails going out, phishing emails that look like they're coming from that particular bank, credit unions, credit checks, etc. So many of you would potentially might get involved in this issue. You might want to know about this particular industry association. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide, the digital divide in the United States and worldwide. This is the gap between those that have technology and those that do not. So the problem here, they state, is that less advantaged individuals and societies may not enjoy the same benefits of technology as others, right? And the argument is that mobile broadband access isn't the same as at-home connectivity, right? So if you can go to a cafe or a library, that's great, but actually having it at home is where people can make the most steps forward in order to close that digital divide gap. And so the book talks about, yes, developing countries, but also even in developed countries, there's statistics show that people of color have less broadband at home, as well as people who are less affluent might have less access to the internet. And the book gives lots of different examples of how Microsoft and a handful of different organizations have tried to close this gap. My personal experience is that as you know, I also sometimes work at Compton College, which is one of the poorest zip codes in probably all of the country. And there, the students have a lot of access to technology. They've really gotten a lot of funding from the federal and state government to offer laptops, to offer broadband at your home. They will pay for that. And also those little tokens that you can plug into your computer so you can travel with internet as well. That can all be paid for when you're a student at Compton College. So they're hoping, again, to close that divide. Let's hop onto the next slide, which talks more about that digital divide. So here, there's a few statistics, right? In 2013, they said that nearly 98% of American homes were able to access the internet on some sort of high-speed broadband network, either at home or at work, which makes sense, right? Because most people, almost all the people do have high-speed internet. And by 2017, more than 52% of people on the planet still did not have internet access. I find that so interesting, right? Because so many of us that do here in the US, still half of the people on the planet don't have internet access, right? And so obviously that means that places in developing countries, it's quite limited. And the average global internet speed was 7.7 megabytes per second, which is actually quite slow. And in places like Nigeria, it can be as low as 1.5 MBSP. So megabits per second. So really interesting just to take a step back and be grateful for the moment as to how much internet access that we have here on a regular basis. Okay, that ends part 1 of this chapter. I will leave you there and come back and create another video for the second half of chapter 11.